Hey readers, I am bringing another book out of the vault for you guys today. I am bringing Cupcakes and Cowboys out and releasing it to you. This is another book that I have since unpublished the ebook and the print versions from everywhere, and then I have rewritten it, changed it a little bit, and re-released it as Never Say Match as part of the Match series. But this original version of the story is still so fun. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. It was the first cowboy story I ever wrote. I did it as part of an anthology I did with some other authors. It was a lot of fun, and I had a lot of fun delving into Cassidy and Jace's story. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, like and comment on the video so that I can make more audiobooks available to you guys. Happy listening!
Cupcakes and Cowboys, Sunset Plains Romance Book 1. Written by Lindzee Armstrong. Narrated by Stacey Glemboski. Dedicated to my Oklahoma grandmother, Geraldine Winters, who always believed one day I'd be published. I miss you. Chapter 1. The minutes right before 10 a.m. were by far the most nerve-wracking part of Cassidy's day. She looked around the bakery with a critical eye, trying to find something out of place. The Victorian couch and 2 high-backed chairs that she'd reupholstered sat at the front of the store, the lines from the dustbuster still visible on the fabric. The mismatched tables and chairs, yard sale finds she'd painted vibrant colors, had been wiped down. The display case next to the cash register overflowed with freshly baked cupcakes, cookies, and cakes, the front of the case showing no smudges or fingerprints. She could still smell the key lime from the cupcake of the day, mixing with the scent of the more traditional chocolate and vanilla. The minute hand on the large wall clock ticked. 10 o'clock exactly. She took a deep breath, then flipped the sign on the glass front door from closed to open, praying she'd sell enough today to cover her rent and basic costs. No easy feat in a town as small as Sunset Plains, where the customers were loyal, but few. If her parents didn't generously let her live at home rent-free, she'd never have been able to qualify for the bank loan that allowed her to open Cupcakes and Cowboys. The next half hour was quiet, with only the soft sounds of the radio to keep her company. Cassidy didn't let the lack of customers dampen her spirits. Mondays were always her slowest day of the week, and mornings were even slower. She sat on the stool behind the counter, using the iPad that doubled as her cash register to respond to emails, when the bell on the front door jingled. Cassidy looked up, her heart jumping in anticipation of her first customer of the day. The shadow against the frosted glass door was short and curvy, suggesting a woman. She hoped it was Mrs. Smith. She always bought one of the more expensive cakes to satisfy her sweet tooth. But it wasn't elderly Mrs. Smith at the door. Annabeth Collins walked in, the morning light highlighting her platinum curls briefly before the door swung shut. She set her sunglasses on top of her head and walked across the laminate floor, the click of her cowboy boots echoing in the empty room as her eyes took in everything. Annabeth and Cassidy hadn't run in the same circles in high school, but they'd been friendly to each other. When your graduating class contained 32 people, you tended to get to know everyone pretty well. "Good morning," Cassidy said, smiling at Annabeth. She wasn't the type to eat carbs or sugar, but her mother was a frequent customer. Annabeth looked around, her gaze approving. "This is a right fine shop you've got here. Mama talks about it a lot. I've been meaning to stop in." "Thank you. I'm really happy with how it turned out. What can I do for you today?" Annabeth set her purse on the counter, the diamond in her engagement ring flashing. "I want you to bake my wedding cake." Cassidy inhaled sharply, her chest suddenly ice cold in direct contrast to the warm June day. Her mind flashed back to the last wedding cake she'd baked and decorated. Her own. She'd spent hours on the gum paste flowers and baked a tier of spice cake, Drew's favorite, even though the smell had made her nauseated. She still didn't know what her mom did with the cake when Drew never showed up at the church. It had been 339 days, but her heart still bled every time she thought about it. Cassidy looked away, straightening the small stack of customer loyalty cards next to the cash register. I don't do wedding cakes, sorry. I know you don't like to do them, but you did that one in high school for Bethany Edwards, and it was beautiful. Thank you. Cassidy had done a few wedding cakes, but she'd turned down every single request since Drew left, despite how badly she needed the money. A wedding cake is the focus of the reception, and I need someone I know will do a good job. Here, I have a picture. Annabeth pulled a wrinkled paper from her purse and handed it to Cassidy. The cake was 5 tiers, with white fondant and elegant silver piping. Pink sugar flowers trailed down the side. Cassidy took a deep breath, fighting to control her emotions. It was remarkably similar to the cake she'd made for herself. Did Annabeth remember? Surely not. It wasn't like it had been served at any reception. Tears burned, and Cassidy blinked quickly, forcing them back. She thought about the money the cake would bring in, enough to pay an entire month's rent on the bakery. But then she remembered the way panic had engulfed her when her mom said no one could find Drew. She'd clawed at her wedding dress, the tight fabric on her growing stomach forcing her to lean over a trash can and throw up before her mother could undo all the buttons. I can't, Cassidy said, forcing the words through her constricted airway. I'm really sorry. I can recommend a few people who would do a great job. You're the only bakery in town. There are lots of bakeries in Tulsa that are reputable. I want to order a wedding cake from you. Annabeth folded her arms, her lips pulling down in a pout. I don't want to drive an hour to Tulsa the day before my wedding to pick up a cake. Can't you make an exception, just this once? Cassidy's mind flashed to sitting on her bed that night, panic pumping through her veins with every heartbeat. She'd discovered blood when using the restroom. Her mother's arms had wrapped tight around her as she gasped, each cramp more intense than the last. She and Drew planned on spending their wedding night in Oklahoma City. Instead, she'd ended up in the emergency room without him. I'm more than happy to cater the reception or provide refreshments for the bridal shower, Cassidy said. But I can't do the cake. Annabeth's eyes flashed with anger. I'd think a new bakery wouldn't turn away paying customers. I just want my wedding day to be perfect. Cassidy's eyes stung with unshed tears, and she felt her composure slipping. As far as she was concerned, any wedding day that ended with the bride and groom in the same room was a successful one. I'm really sorry, Annabeth. A sick pit formed in her stomach as she thought about how much money she was turning away. And then she thought of lying on a cold, sterile bed in the ER and hearing the words, "The heartbeat's gone. I'm sorry." The stress proved too much for the unplanned pregnancy. Even though the thought of being a mother terrified Cassidy, losing the baby and Drew all at once had devastated her. Annabeth folded her arms, her eyes narrowing into slits as she glared. He's in a movie, you know, with Jase Larson. I saw a trailer for it the other day. Cassidy's knees trembled. What? It's been a year, Cassidy. Get over it. He obviously has. Annabeth whirled and stomped toward the door, her blonde hair swaying against her back as she yanked it open. She walked past the front window and disappeared down the sidewalk, probably headed to the pharmacy her parents owned 3 doors down to complain to her mother. Cassidy stumbled to the iPad, bringing up the search engine and typing in Drew Harrington. Numerous articles appeared from various celebrity magazines. Her hand shook so badly it took 3 tries to properly tap the first link. She scanned the article, her mind barely comprehending what she read. The interview talked about how pleased Drew was to be in a movie with A-list actor Jase Larson, who'd taken Drew under his wing and become one of his closest friends in California. She tapped on another article and another. By all accounts, the movie, a romantic drama with a love triangle between 2 war buddies and the girl they left at home, was supposed to be one of the blockbuster hits of the summer. Why hadn't she heard about it before now? Had she been that out of touch? Her finger hovered over a link for the trailer. This is what he'd abandoned her for. She tapped on the link. Drew filled the screen, dressed in full combat gear and dragging Jase Larson to safety. He looked so different from how she remembered him. His face was covered in dark scruff, his hair hidden by a helmet. His cheekbones were more defined, his arms obviously muscled. "I promised I'd get you home," Drew yelled as an explosion went off in the distance. "Take care of her," Jase said, his eyes wide and compelling. "Tell her I love her. Promise me he'll at least do that much. Don't you dare give up," Drew said, his voice thick with determination. "She needs you." Another explosion went off, this one much closer, and Drew and Jase both flew into the air. The trailer was good. She'd always known Drew had what it took to make it big, had believed in him so fiercely that she'd ignored her own career goals to help him with his. She'd spent hours on set, silently watching as he filmed various indie movies. A few even won awards. She tapped the home button on the iPad with an angry jab. He'd taken a step forward in his career and left her to deal with the mess at home, alone. "You're better off without him," Cassidy reminded herself, and in the end, it was better that a baby hadn't been born into the mess that was her life. She went through the rest of the day on autopilot. At 6 o'clock, she closed the shop and left without going through her usual evening routine, taking the unsold product with her. She thought of the time she'd painstakingly spent that morning piping on frosting and wished that she could sell out just once. One day, she promised herself. For now, she'd continue sharing her unsold cupcakes and cookies with the ranch hands so they didn't go to waste. The sun glowed low in the sky, on its path toward setting. Cassidy rolled down the window of her truck and let the warm June breeze play with her hair as the stress melted away. Drew could have Hollywood. She would stay right here in Oklahoma and run her shop. She never should have put her dream aside for his. They'd planned to move to California after the wedding, and she dreaded it. City life didn't hold any appeal for her. She waved at the pastor's wife as they passed each other on the narrow road, then turned down the long driveway to the ranch. The blacktop was rough with divots and potholes from the ice storms that winter, jostling the truck back and forth. Cassidy saw Cupcake, her chocolate and cream paint mare, grazing near the fence, and made a mental note to visit her after dinner. Cassidy parked on the grass outside the red farmhouse and wandered inside, her shoulders relaxing at the comfort of home. She inhaled deeply, her nose filling with the scent of roast and hot rolls. "I'm home, Mama," Cassidy called, following her nose to the kitchen. "Do you need help with—" She froze under the archway between the kitchen and dining room, zeroing in on the unfamiliar man sitting at the bar stool. Her mother hadn't mentioned they were having company for dinner. That was the absolute last thing she wanted to deal with tonight. His black t-shirt hugged his muscled and tanned arms. He looked over his shoulder at her, and a slow smile appeared, showcasing his blindingly white Hollywood grin. A dimple popped in one cheek. She hadn't believed a jaw could be that chiseled in real life. She'd always assumed his good looks were a product of lots of airbrushing. Jase Larson, A-list celebrity, Drew's co-star and new best friend. "Hi." He rose from the bar stool and strode toward her. His jeans clung to his legs with each step, and Cassidy's heart slammed against her ribcage. "I'm Jase." Cassidy's hand was in his before she registered the action. His shake was strong and firm, and she fought the sudden and ridiculous urge to giggle. He let her go, and she folded her arms, her palms clammy with nerves. Jase Larson. What was he doing in her kitchen? And where was her mother? The awe at his unexpected presence disappeared as she remembered Drew's praise of the man in the article she'd read. "I know who you are. Did Drew send you?" Jace's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry?" His confusion seemed genuine. But if Drew had taught her anything, it was to never trust an actor. They were experts at faking. Pain sliced viciously, a release of energy that left her feeling sick. An actor. In her home. One that worked with Drew. Where's my mom? And how did you end up at my house? She went upstairs to switch the laundry, and our grandfathers served together in the army. Cassidy vaguely remembered being told this after seeing a preview for one of Jace's romantic comedies, but that was years ago, and his association with Drew had pushed it out of her mind. That doesn't explain why you're here. Jace's full lips lifted in a slow smile, deepening the dimple in his cheek. I'm a method actor. His tone oozed with arrogant confidence, as though she should bow in awe at his dedication to his craft. Drew had been like that. And I just got a part in a Western. My grandfather talked to your grandfather, who talked to your dad. I'll be staying at the ranch for the next 4 months to prepare for my role. Chapter 2. When Jase had contacted Randy Erickson about spending 4 months at Star Ranch, he'd wanted one thing: escape from Hollywood. He hadn't expected to run into a gorgeous woman on his first night there. She wore shorts that hugged her hips, a fitted gray t-shirt that emphasized her curves, and cowboy boots. Was that flour dusting her shoulder? It gave her an industrial, hard-working look that he adored. Blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun emphasized her prominent cheekbones and stormy gray eyes. She folded her arms across her chest, and Jase fought to hold back a grin. He loved a woman with a little fight. Hollywood types were way too accommodating. You're seriously going to stay here? Cassidy's full lips turned down in an enticing pout. He'd met her type before. Spoiled prima donnas who threw tantrums when plans were changed without their approval. There aren't a lot of hotels in town, and to get the true ranch experience, I should live like a ranch hand. Jase needed to completely immerse himself in this role, and not just play the character, but be the character. Acting no longer held the thrill it once had, and with each new role, he struggled to regain the fire by diving deeper and deeper into character. He hadn't grown up dreaming of one day being a famous actor. He'd always been one. His mother was an award-winning producer and director. The fact that she was a successful woman in a man's world only made Hollywood adore her more. Jase had been acting since before he could walk. Other career choices were never discussed, and in the beginning, he loved it, but not anymore. Cassidy snorted, wrinkling her nose as though she smelled manure. You're going to wake up at dawn, feed the animals, mend fences. Let me stop you right there, sweetheart. The word felt as strange on his tongue as the day-old stubble on his face, but it seemed like something a ranch hand would say. He walked over to Cassidy and didn't stop until their boots were touching. The top of her head barely came to his chest, and he stared down into her gray eyes, which crackled with anger. He expected her to step back, maybe play with her hair and look away with a coy flutter of her eyelashes. But she didn't flinch, didn't back down. Her feet didn't budge an inch, and his respect for her grew. I'm going to do all of it. For the next 4 months, I don't want you to treat me any differently than you would any other ranch hand. Oh, were you expecting special treatment? Maybe the women in Hollywood are impressed by your good looks and Oscar nomination, even if you did lose, but I couldn't care less. Jase smirked because he knew it would infuriate her. I can see that. She did step back then, and he felt a surge of victory, like he'd won some unspoken battle. Her eyes glowed with anger. I wouldn't want to interfere with your method acting. Ranch hands don't hang out in the family's kitchen. She tossed her head toward the door. The bunkhouse is around back. Your mother invited me to stay for dinner. In fact, she told him to eat with the family as much as he pleased. Jase guessed that for the money he was paying the Ericksons, they'd let him eat whatever and wherever he wanted while he was here. If the mouth-watering scent of baking bread was an indication of Sarah Erickson's cooking abilities, he'd take his meals here every day. Homemade rolls, not the gluten-free healthy substitutes they served at upscale restaurants, or the dry and crumbly varieties at grocery stores, but real rolls, probably made with animal fat and loads of butter. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, light and quick. A moment later, Sarah entered the kitchen, her apron hanging on her slender frame. She had the same gray eyes as her daughter and the same blonde curls as well, although Sarah's were streaked with silver. She came to an abrupt stop, her eyes brimming with guilt. "Oh, you're home, Cassidy." Cassidy jabbed a finger in his direction. "When were you going to mention this?" Venom dripped off the word, making Jase grin even wider. "They probably didn't want to anger the beast," Jase said. Sarah's lined brow told him he'd hit the nail on the head. "I see you've met Jase. He arrived not long before you, so I haven't had a chance to show him around yet. Why don't you take him to the bunkhouse and give him a feel for the place? Dinner will be ready in about 30 minutes. Cassidy's eyes narrowed and she folded her arms. "Are you sure you don't need help, Mama? Getting Jase settled in is help enough." There was a finality to her voice that apparently even Cassidy couldn't argue, because she gave a heavy sigh and pushed her way outside. The bright blue door stuck as it swung closed, not quite shutting. "She'll warm up eventually," Sarah said. "She doesn't like actors much, but that's just because the only one she's ever known did her wrong." Jase felt a twinge in his gut. Maybe she wasn't a spoiled brat used to getting her way, and his presence caused her real distress. But no, he was overthinking things. He wondered what high school crush slighted Cassidy in his pursuit of community theater. Whatever had happened, Ice Queen certainly knew how to hold a grudge. "Thanks, Sarah." Jase gave her his best celebrity smile and followed Cassidy's exit route, pulling the door firmly shut behind him. Cassidy was nearly to the barn, and Jase lengthened his stride to catch up. The grass was a lush green, but sparse and matted, as though it grew wild and wasn't the result of seed or sod. He liked the way the grass just was. No one tried to force it to be something it wasn't. Jase inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the clean, humid air. After a lifetime of living in Southern California, he hadn't expected to notice the humidity, but Oklahoma was definitely muggier than he was used to. He fell into step beside Cassidy, sidestepping a muddy patch in the grass. "So, you hate actors, huh?" Cassidy barely glanced at him. "They're arrogant, self-involved narcissists. You've known me 5 minutes. Sometimes that's all it takes." Jase barely held back a chuckle. Nope, she was just spunky. He'd met his fair share of women in Hollywood, everyone from simpering, spineless socialites who hung on his every word, to women who pretended disdain in a thinly veiled attempt to hold his interest. Cassidy was different, though. He could tell his presence here really did infuriate her. She didn't like him. It was refreshing. A horse with a dark brown coat snorted as they walked by the pasture, the smell of manure strong. The red paint was chipped and peeling, but the 2-story structure, complete with a hayloft, held a certain charm. They rounded the barn, and that's when the bunkhouse came into view. Jase wrinkled his nose. He hoped the smell wasn't as strong inside. Would his character even notice if it was, or was that the sort of thing you became noseblind to? The bunkhouse was nothing special, just a 1-story building with gray siding, a pitched roof, and a rather boxy front. Windows on either side of the front door, and no porch or eaves. A 4-foot square cement slab had been poured in front of the door, presumably to keep the mud and dirt to a minimum. The lack of frills and decorations made it obvious men lived here. "Cassidy," a voice called. A man strode across the grass toward them in a worn gray cowboy hat and boots, with the bronzed skin of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. "Mason!" Cassidy ignored Jase and changed directions, meeting the man halfway and giving him a hug. Mason held on to Cassidy a moment longer than was appropriate, his eyes lingering on her face as she pulled away. "Your mama just radioed me." Mason held a hand out toward Jase, eyes hooded with distrust. "Mason Crenshaw. You'll be shadowing me while you're here." Jase took the hand in a firm shake. "Jase Larson, nice to meet you." Cassidy took a step back, her eyes narrowed. "You knew about this?" Mason scratched his forehead, tilting the cowboy hat back. "Not for long. Your dad just talked to me last night." Cassidy's jaw clenched. She whirled and strode back across the grass without another word. "Cassidy!" Mason called. She ignored him, heading for a grazing horse in a nearby pasture. Mason let out a curse. "Knew she'd be mad when she found out, but Randy asked me not to say anything." "I appreciate the discretion. She certainly seems to dislike me. Are you and Cassidy—" Mason pulled his hat low over his eyes, ignoring the question. "Well, come inside and I'll show you around." The bunkhouse pretty much looked like the pictures Jase had found online while researching. The door opened into a large living room with a multitude of couches and a large television on one wall. Jase had expected a mess, but was surprised at how clean the place was. No clutter, and no dirt on the floor. Boots were neatly lined up next to the door. "Where are all the men?" Jase asked, looking around the empty living room. "A few cows fell sick today." Mason walked through a set of sliding barn doors that led into an open kitchen with a long dining room table. "Mealtimes are at 6, noon, and 6. You're welcome to anything in that fridge or those cupboards," he pointed, "if you get hungry. On days you'll be out on the range, you pack your own lunch before heading out." Jase tingled with excitement. This was so different from any role he'd ever played. Maybe it would be the role that finally helped him regain the fire he'd once felt. He'd shadowed soldiers and doctors, and once even a forensic scientist for roles, but never a cowboy. This life overflowed with long days and hard work, but something about the simplicity appealed to him. They left the kitchen and walked down a narrow hallway. The communal bathroom featured 6 of everything, and the bunk room held 2 rows of bunk beds, enough to sleep 20. Mason pointed to a top bunk near the middle of one row. "That's your bed. Randy said you don't want special treatment, so don't expect any from me." Jase raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "All the ranch hands live here?" "No, just the temporary hires. There's another bunkhouse on the other side of the barn with more private rooms for the permanent employees. And some of the guys have families and live in town. I'm in the other bunkhouse if you need me. I'll pick you up after breakfast." "Thanks, Mason." Jase gave the man a firm handshake. "Anytime. I better go make sure Cassidy's okay." He disappeared out the door, leaving Jase alone in the room. Maybe Mason and Cassidy weren't together, but it seemed like Mason certainly wanted to be. Jase almost felt bad about putting his mentor in the doghouse. Almost. Something in the flash of Cassidy's eyes made him long to figure her out. His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. His heart dropped when he saw who it was. Mother. She'd never been Mama, like Cassidy called Sarah, or even Mom. Jase wanted to ignore the call, but knew if he didn't answer, she'd keep bugging him until he did. Maybe even send some of her people to hunt him down. "Hello, Mother." "You can't seriously be in Oklahoma right now." No greeting, no, "Hey, how are you?" She always did have a way of cutting straight to the point. "I'm researching my new role." And on his own dime. Production didn't mind funding a week or 2 of research, which is what he'd done in the beginning, but he couldn't embrace a role so quickly. Slowly, the time had stretched from a few weeks to a few months. Eccentric, even by Hollywood standards, but his performances showed the effort he put in. "Research is a week. Delaying production so you can shovel manure for 4 months is inexcusable." Jase's stomach twisted. The producer had been annoyed, but agreed to Jase's terms. How had she found out? "You aren't involved in this film, so I don't see why it matters." There was no pleasing her. She wanted the Academy Award-winning performance, but it annoyed her endlessly when he put in the time. "I am now. Clearly, you can't be left to your own devices on this one. Production starts in a month. If you haven't immersed yourself into your role by then, we'll recast it." And the phone clicked dead. Chapter 3. Cassidy stormed away from the bunkhouse, not allowing herself the pleasure of watching Jase's backside as he walked inside. She couldn't believe she'd have to put up with that that actor for the next 4 months. Really, when it came down to it, she couldn't think of a worse word to call him. Jase didn't seem to have any idea that she was Drew's ex-fiancé. The fact that Drew hadn't thought she was worth mentioning hurt more than she'd expected it to, and made her dislike Jase even more. If he was best friends with a jerk like Drew, then Jase couldn't be a very good guy. Well, if he expected her to be starstruck and to fall all over him, he could think again. She would spend the next 4 months making sure he knew just how unimportant he was. And she'd start by acting like he didn't exist. The darkening clouds mirrored her mood, and wind rustled the leaves of the trees. She kicked a dirt clod across the grass, then stomped up the side steps and into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind her. Her mom looked up in surprise. She held a peach in one hand and a knife in the other, expertly skinning it. "You're already back?" Cassidy grunted. She yanked open the fridge and pulled out the makings for a salad. Her mother provided one at nearly every meal, and she was sure this one would be no different. She needed to keep her hands busy. "Where's Jase?" her mom asked. "At the bunkhouse." Mama dropped the now sliced peach into the bowl and washed her hands, then turned to scowl at Cassidy. "I thought I told you to show him around. He's a big boy. I'm sure he can figure it out. I raised you better than this. Where's your sense of hospitality?" "It must have been shocked out of me." Cassidy rinsed the carrots, then slammed them down on the cutting board and picked up a knife. "Why didn't you tell me he was coming?" Mama took a deep breath. "Your father and I made what we felt was the best decision for the ranch. We knew if we told you an actor would be staying here, it'd upset you, and figured there was no use in poking the sleeping bull until we had to." "Did you tell Tanner?" "It might have come up when we spoke to him on the phone a few days ago." "Oh, so you told your kid that isn't living here and won't be affected by it. Thanks a lot." Cassidy glared at her mom, chopping the carrots forcefully. "Careful, or you're going to take off a finger." The garage door opened, then closed. Her dad's off-key whistle and the shuffling of boots being removed floated in from the mudroom. A moment later, he entered the kitchen. His graying hair was matted down from a day spent wearing a cowboy hat, his flannel shirt dusted with dirt. He paused when he saw them. "Well, aren't you a bunch of sour faces to come home to?" He leaned down and kissed Mama, then turned on the faucet and washed his hands. "Cassidy's met our new house guest." Mama raised an eyebrow meaningfully. "Thanks for that, by the way." Cassidy dumped the carrots over the greens and grabbed a cucumber. "It was a fantastic surprise." "We aren't in a position to be turning down good money." Dad grabbed a towel and dried his hands, his gaze steady and unyielding. "He's paying us enough we can avoid another bank loan. We've lost a lot of cattle lately." Cassidy thought of Annabeth and her face heated uncomfortably. Her dad was making a business decision, and Cassidy should have done the same. She knew the cattle had been sick, that the ranch desperately needed money, but it didn't make this any easier. "I hate this." "Give the boy a chance," Dad said. "Just because Drew left you high and dry doesn't mean the entire profession is of the same caliber." "I know it's hard, and probably brings up memories you'd rather keep buried," Mama said. "But I expect you to keep a civil tongue while Jase is here. We need this." "He's in a movie with him." Cassidy spit out the words, her mouth bitter with the taste. "Annabeth Collins dropped by the bakery today and told me. He's been going on in interviews about how much Jase has helped him and how the two of them are best friends." The kitchen fell silent. Her parents looked back and forth between each other, their eyes filled with anxiety. "Sweetie, we had no idea," Mama said. "He reminds me of him. Same arrogance, same smirk, same attitude." Cassidy thought of the way he'd confidently proclaimed he was a method actor, so like Drew. She had no doubt that after a day on the ranch he'd prove as feebly committed to his craft, too. "I'm sorry about that," Dad said. "If we'd known, I would have thought a lot harder before letting him come." So you'll send him home? Cassidy held the knife over the cucumber, her chest filling with hope. No, it doesn't change how things are now. Cassidy sagged against the counter, dropping the knife. For her, it changed everything. 26 days. That's how far she was from what should have been her first wedding anniversary. She was supposed to be in California with Drew, cooking him dinner and struggling to keep the apartment clean with a rambunctious 6-month-old constantly creating messes. Her throat tightened and she curled her fingers toward her palm. Would it have been a boy or girl? Would he or she have been crawling yet? It's better this way, she reminded herself. I'm finally following my dreams. I never would have had the bakery if we'd gotten married. The kitchen door swung open and Jace's tall, muscular build filled the frame. Drew always had a knack for barging in on conversations as well. Jace shut the door and paused, looking around the room. I'm sorry. Am I interrupting something? Cassidy glared at him, then returned her focus to the cucumber. Just my life? Of course not, Mama said, her voice falsely bright. We were just having a chat. Dinner's nearly ready. Can I do anything to help? Jase asked. Please, take a seat and relax. You're our guest. We'll get everything on the table in a jiffy. Cassidy couldn't contain her snort of derision. A real rancher rarely got to sit and relax. Jase didn't want to learn about ranch life. He wanted to pretend to learn about it so he could continue telling magazines about his method acting and how dedicated he was to his craft, just like Drew. Her mind flashed back to the time he'd taken her rock climbing for experience and ended up complaining the whole lesson, or the welding class he'd quit after 2 days because the shop was too hot and it made him sweat, or a million other things he'd done halfway in the name of improving his performance. She stifled a sigh. And she dropped out of culinary school, turned down an internship, and put off opening her bakery for him. Dad sat down next to Jase, and the two talked about ranching while Cassidy helped Mama finish preparing dinner. Soon they all sat around the square table. Cassidy tried to stay far away from Jase, but with only 4 of them, it wasn't really an option. Besides, they all had their usual spots at the table, and the only free space was right next to Cassidy. Dad reached out and grasped hers and Mama's hands. Cassidy's heart dropped to her stomach. Saying grace, how could she have forgotten? Jase looked startled, but quickly accepted Mama's outstretched hand. Mama gave Cassidy a stern glare, and Cassidy reluctantly slipped her hand into Jase's. It was unexpectedly warm, his palms and fingers smooth against her skin. No calluses, Cassidy thought, trying to focus on that instead of how strong yet gentle his grip was. I bet he's never done a hard day's work in his life. Drew's hands had been like that. It should have been her first red flag. Cassidy struggled to focus as Dad said grace. Jase was still an arrogant, entitled actor, someone who associated with Drew, no matter how nice his hand felt in hers. The second Dad said amen, Cassidy dropped Jase's hand like a hot potato. He raised his bowed head and blinked his startlingly amber-green eyes open. Cassidy almost lost herself in his gaze, until she caught his smirk. She yanked the napkin off the table and into her lap, calling Jase every 4-letter word she could think of in her head. It would be hard to ignore him if he kept goading her. So, Jase, Mama said, handing him the bowl of potatoes. Tell us about yourself. Not much to tell, Jase said. Must be very exciting to live in Hollywood, Mama said. We went on a vacation to Southern California when Cassidy was still in pigtails and spent a few hours at the Walk of Fame. It's a nice area. Jase handed Cassidy the salad and she took it, careful not to let her fingers brush his. But I'm not home very often. I spend a lot of time on location when filming. We're setting most of the Western in Texas, so I'll be there for a few months. I'm not sure what role I'll take on after that. I'm keeping my options open. Cassidy remembered all too well the erratic schedule of an actor. Even though Drew had only done indie films while they were together, he'd still traveled to location, on his own dime. It had been a constant source of contention between them, especially once they found out about the baby. "I always thought it would be nice to travel," Mama said. "There's still time." Jace passed the bowl of potatoes. "I bet you'd love Australia." "It's hard to find someone to take care of the ranch for more than a few days at a time." Randy took a bite of roast, chewing slowly. "That's your first lesson in ranching. The ranch always comes first. Vacations are few and far between, and when they do happen, they're not very long." "Ranching sounds like a demanding profession," Jace said. Cassidy rolled her eyes, unable to keep quiet any longer. "Thank you, Captain Obvious." Mama's fork clattered against her plate, and her eyes narrowed in a glare. "Cassidy." "No, she's right." An easy grin split Jace's face, making his dimples pop. Focus on his bad qualities, Cassidy thought. Arrogant actor. This whole thing is a game to him. He's playing me like I'm a character with a script. "I'm fascinated by ranching," Jace continued. "Not just the ranch itself, but the family values ranchers have." "Family is very important," Randy said. "Both the family you're born into and the one you choose." If family was so important, then why had her parents put her in such an uncomfortable position? And why hadn't Tanner, her dear older brother, at least warned her? Cassidy pushed back from the table, no longer hungry. "I'll be in my room. Somehow, I've lost my appetite." "You'll have to excuse Cassidy," she heard her mom say as she climbed the stairs. "She has some personal stuff going on, and this is hard for her." Cassidy quickened her pace, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Yes, this was hard for her. Not that anyone cared. Her parents had brought a wolf into the family and told Cassidy to treat him like a king. She spent the rest of the evening in her room, flipping through television channels and playing the guitar while trying to take her mind off the handsome man relaxing in the bunkhouse. At 9 o'clock, she turned out the lights and tried to fall asleep, but the wind howled outside, battering against the windows. Cassidy tossed and turned as the wind faded into pounding rain. Around 11 o'clock, she knew the power went out, could tell when the hum of the air conditioner stopped. Slowly, the temperature rose to a muggy and uncomfortable level. She worried about the bakery, but even if the power was out there, the food should keep until morning. Cassidy tossed the blankets aside as the rain continued to roar outside. What was Drew like in Hollywood? He'd always acted different when she visited him on set than he did when they were alone. She should have been concerned, but instead had been vaguely annoyed by his attitude. It never occurred to her that fake Drew was the one she knew, and real Drew was the one she encountered on set. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by thunder she felt clear down to her bones. The house groaned and creaked as the wind continued to abuse it. Cassidy shifted again, rolling onto her side and trying to find a comfortable position. If she fell asleep now, she'd get almost 5 hours of sleep before she had to wake up. That was the only thing she didn't like about owning a bakery, starting her days at 4 a.m. She finally managed a few restless hours of sleep before dragging herself out of bed. She took a cool shower in an attempt to wake herself up, then threw on some clothes and drove to the bakery. Once there, she unlocked the back door and stepped inside the kitchen, flipping the light switch. Nothing happened. She flipped the switch again, then again and again. The power was on at the house, so why was it still out here? "Not today," she moaned, striding to the freezer that held a week's worth of ingredients. But she already knew what she'd find. There was no buzz from the appliances. She pulled the door open. The light remained off, but the air inside was still cool. She slammed the door shut and wrenched open the fridge, only to discover the same thing. She shut the door, trying to decide what to do. Maybe the power was on, but the breakers had flipped during the storm. She headed back outside and around the building. She noticed the black scorch marks on the siding first. They trailed in a line from the roof down to the breaker box. She bent down, her heart in her throat, and slowly opened the box. The inside was blackened, a few of the switches partially melted. Lightning had struck the building. Despair welled inside her, and she shut the door, slumping against the wall. Repairing the damage to the building and breaker would thankfully be her landlord's responsibility, but had the lightning fried the circuits in the ancient fridge and freezer? And how long would it take to repair everything? She had hundreds of dollars worth of ingredients in those two appliances, and it would all start defrosting in a few hours. Between the poor insulation in the old appliances and the Oklahoma heat, it wouldn't take long. For most businesses, losing ingredients would be inconvenient, but only 4 months in, with a tiny client base and slim profit margins, it was devastating. Cassidy pushed herself off the wall and walked back inside. With a lot of grunting and groaning, she pulled the fridge and freezer far enough away from the wall to inspect the backside. There were a few blackened areas, but she couldn't tell if they were the result of the lightning, and didn't remember if they'd already been there. Hatred welled within her for Drew. This was all his fault. If not for him and the wedding bills he'd stuck her with, she wouldn't have had to buy the crappy, unreliable used appliances, making this setback a much smaller problem. Drew, who was continuing to invade her life in the form of his best friend, Jase. She imagined discussing today's disaster over the dinner table tonight. Jase would lean back in his chair, a haughty smirk on his criminally attractive face as he told her how ridiculous it was to even try to run a bakery in a town as small as Sunset Plains. That's what Drew had always told her when she brought up her dream. It was why she'd dropped out of culinary school and turned down the internship. She regretted telling Annabeth no now more than ever. Slowly, she rose to her feet. She closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths. I can do this, she thought. It was a setback, but it wasn't the end of the world. Maybe it wasn't as bad as she thought, and the fridge and freezer and the ingredients inside were salvageable. She pulled out her phone, ready to get to work. Chapter 4. 1 month, or he'd lose the part. Jase stared at the ceiling that was only a few feet from his face and took a deep breath. The air was hot and muggy, barely cooling back down after a night with no power. Rain had pounded against the window panes all night as thunder shook the building clear down to the foundation. He'd tossed and turned, unable to get comfortable in the too short and too narrow bunk. His thoughts had paraded in circles for hours. Feet shuffled against the wood floor, bringing him back to the present. A moment later, he heard the bathroom door open, then a click as someone switched on their phone. Soft snores still filled the space, but he heard cowboys stirring in their beds as well. Jase illuminated his cell just enough to see the time, 4:49. Mason said most men woke up around 5. Jase shouldn't be surprised his mother had weaseled her way onto the production and was trying to take control of his career. She'd been doing it since he was a baby. Her entire life revolved around Hollywood, and by extension, so had his. Only recently had he stopped to consider whether it was what he really wanted. 1 month. His chest tightened. He'd been at Star Ranch for less than 24 hours, but already he didn't want to leave. His thoughts drifted to Cassidy and the way she'd stormed off at dinner. Her tantrum went way beyond someone who simply didn't like actors. Would he be able to figure out her story in only a month? What he hated worst of all was the fact his mother was right. It was irresponsible to delay production for 4 months of research. No one loved their job 100% of the time, and he certainly wasn't exempt from that. This film might just be the one to help him regain his spark. He would throw himself into research and return to Hollywood when the time came, without a backward glance. Time to pony up, cowboy, he thought, and grinned wryly at how country the phrase sounded. He was here to research a role so he could hopefully do a performance worthy of an Oscar win and not just a nomination. Intriguing women like Cassidy weren't part of the plan. The men didn't say much as they got ready for the day. Jase took a quick shower in one of the empty stalls in the communal bathroom, then made his way to the dining room. The food was spread out buffet-style on the counter. Jase grabbed a plate and eagerly loaded up. Hash browns, eggs, bacon, sausage, biscuits, and gravy blended together in a perfect balance of scents that had his mouth watering and stomach rumbling. Dinner last night had been uncomfortable, killing his appetite, despite Sarah's excellent cooking. He'd kept watching Cassidy. Her shoulders had radiated tension, her brow furrowed in agitation. Jase sat down at the dining room table, one of the last to arrive. The other men ate in relative silence. A few of them flicked glances his direction. Jase wondered if they were usually this quiet in the morning, or if his presence changed the routine. He turned to the man beside him and stuck out a hand. "I'm Jase." "Brighton." The man took his hand and shook it firmly. A youthful face suggested he was right out of high school. "How long have you been working here?" "Only a few months. Trying to save up money so I can go to college in the fall." Jase opened his mouth to respond, but a hand landed on his shoulder. Mason glared down at him. "Are you ready for today?" Mason asked, the words a growl. Jase glanced at Brighton, who quickly turned back to his plate of food, as though eager to avoid Mason. "More than ready," Jase said. "I can't wait to dive into ranch life. It's hard work that a city boy like you isn't used to. We've got a lot to get through today. I hope you can keep up." Jase blinked, surprised at the accusatory tone. "Don't worry about me slowing you down." Mason grunted. "That storm last night took out a huge section of fencing, and some of the cattle got loose. Some men are already out rustling them up. You and me will be repairing a section of fence in the north field." Jase nodded, excitement thrumming through him like an electric hum. "I didn't realize a storm could do so much damage." "The weather is a rancher's worst enemy." The tone clearly suggested Jase should already know this. "Every time we get a thunderstorm, and there are a lot of them in this part of Oklahoma, we end up spending a few days cleaning up the mess. We'll head out as soon as you finish eating." In other words, eat quick or get left behind, Jase thought. But no, he was reading too much into it. Mason was just stressed about the storm and eager to get to work, which suited Jase just fine. He quickly finished his bacon, told Brighton goodbye, and followed Mason outside. He hoped he'd get to do more than just observe today. He needed to be a rancher and immerse himself in this lifestyle. I guess a storm is as good a chance as any, he thought. Because he would make this his best performance yet. It wasn't in him to give anything less than 100%. Besides, while he wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his career, he wanted the decision to be his own, and maintaining his reputation as a professional was part of that. "We'll take the truck." Mason strode off across the grass toward the back of the bunkhouse. "We're not taking a horse?" Mason snorted. "It'd be mighty hard to carry everything on the back of one of the animals. We're not riding the range." "Oh, right." Jase felt stupid, and then angry at Mason for laughing. He was here to learn. If he already knew how ranch life worked, he would have stayed in L.A. An old and battered Ford pickup, the blue paint chipped and fading into rust near the tailgate, was filled to overflowing with wire, wooden fence posts, and tools. "Hop in," Mason said. Jase nodded and opened the door with a loud creak, revealing a bench covered in a neutral brown fabric, frayed to the point of ripping. Dust filtered through the air, and the dashboard was dark from sun rot. A musty, humid smell filled the cab. Jase struggled for a moment with the hand crank, finally getting the window lowered. Mason revved the engine, and they headed down a dirt road, away from the main house and outbuildings. "Nice truck," Jase said. It was worn, but sturdy and hard-working, just like a cowboy. Mason grunted. "It's the ranch's. My truck is a lot nicer kept than this one." Jase leaned his arm out the window, relishing the feel of the warm summer breeze playing with his hair. I think this truck holds a certain charm. How often do the fences need repairing? Depends. Jace gritted his teeth, trying to hold back his frustration. On what? Mason shrugged. Weather, if the cows knock them down, lots of things. Maybe Mason was just a man of few words. That was a common trope in westerns, and tropes were usually based in reality. Jace took a slow, deep breath, then said nothing. Mason drove for 15 minutes down a well-worn dirt path, just wide enough for one vehicle. Tall grass blew gently in the breeze, and fences lined both sides of the road. The land stretched out forever, trees visible in the distance. The flat expanse was so unfamiliar after the hills and beaches of L.A. Jace saw the damaged fence moments before Mason pulled to the side of the road and parked the truck. The sun just crested the trees, bathing the ranch in golden light. Jace didn't see any cows nearby, though. Maybe they were in another pasture? He got out of the truck, striding over to the damaged fence. It looked as though it had been trampled by the animals. Posts were at crazy angles, some of them knocked all the way down, some of them snapped in two, and a 6-foot section of barbed wire had been stomped into the soft mud. Jace reached out to examine the fence. How do you keep the cattle from trampling the fence more often? It's electrified. Jace jerked his hand back, glaring at Mason. Thanks for the warning. It's not electrified right now. Lightning struck the fence and flipped the breakers. That's how the steers got through. We'll turn the fence back on once we've fixed it. Jace wasn't so sure Mason would have warned him if it had been turned on. So what do we do? Mason reached into the back of the truck and pulled out a shovel. I'll set the posts in the holes and you fill them back up with dirt. I'll replace the ones they busted. They worked for an hour in silence. Jace tried to begin a conversation a few times, but Mason's one-word grunts were definitely feeling personal. Jace thought back to the way Mason's arms had lingered around Cassidy when they hugged, and wondered if he viewed Jace as a threat. Was Mason that insecure? The sun slowly rose, heating the air until sweat beaded on Jace's forehead and soaked his collar. Mason did most of the work, only occasionally giving Jace instructions. They finished up the fence as the sun reached its zenith. Let's head back for lunch, Mason said. Then we're going into town to pick up the antibiotics the vet called in for the sick cows. Jace nodded. He helped Mason pick up the tools, then climbed into the truck for the short drive back to the bunkhouse. What's a typical day like? Jace asked. Mason shrugged. Board with our assignments is posted in the administrative building each evening. I work with the horses a lot, but I go out on the range, too. What do you do with the horses? Train them, ride them, make sure they're fed and cared for? Jace ran a frustrated hand through his hair. Did I do something to offend you, Mason? Mason flicked a glance his direction. No. I get the feeling you don't like me. Mason didn't refute Jace's claim. Instead, his scowl deepened. I would think it was obvious why. Enlighten me. Mason's jaw flexed, as though he was trying to decide whether or not to be upfront. Then he said, Drew Harrington. Jace didn't know what he'd expected to hear, that Mason didn't like actors, didn't like people with lots of money, didn't like Californians, that he worried Jace would make a play for Cassidy. But Jace hadn't expected to hear the name of the obnoxious actor he'd worked with on the latest box office hit. What does Drew have to do with anything? Mason flicked a glance at Jace. Hold up a sec. You don't know? Don't know what? Mason rubbed his chin. Drew was Cassidy's fiancé. He left the night before the wedding. That's the last she heard from him. The air flew out of Jace in a gasp. Mason pulled to a stop in the grassy pasture behind the bunkhouse and turned his full attention to Jace. Cassidy, well, Drew was sort of pressured into proposing by Randy because of the circumstances. The whole town was telling Drew to do right by her. They'd been together for a while, and Cassidy really loved him. Mason cleared his throat and looked away. She didn't take his leaving well. Got real sick after he left. Caused quite a scandal around these parts for a while. She still blames him. Jase pieced together what Mason wasn't saying. Cassidy had been pregnant with Drew's child, and he had just left? And Cassidy knows about the movie Drew and I were in together? The magazine articles call you his best friend. Jase wasn't surprised Drew was spreading that rumor. Suddenly, Cassidy's cold shoulder made so much sense. Drew is a lying cheat. He did nothing but try to use me for my connections while on set. You aren't friends? Not even close. The two men sat in silence for a moment. I'm sorry I've been unkind, Mason said. I was upset on behalf of Cassidy. We're good friends. I shouldn't have judged you without knowing the whole story. Thank you. Mason opened the truck door. We should get inside before all the food's gone. Jase nodded. His mind reeled with this new information. Never had Drew mentioned an ex-fiancé. He had, however, showed up to work with a different girl every day and been photographed with a different woman every night. Jase needed to talk to Cassidy and clear the air. Mason was much friendlier during lunch, introducing Jase to a few of the other cowboys and answering questions with more than a grunt. Then Mason grabbed a disposable container from the kitchen and filled it up with leftovers. Who's that for? Jase asked. Cassidy. Her cupcake shop is a few doors down from the pharmacy. I like to bring her lunch when I come into town. She forgets to eat anything good during the day. Jase's heartbeat quickened at the thought of seeing the blonde beauty so soon. But this was good. He could tell her he hadn't been sent to torment her. Maybe then Jase could forget about her and focus on preparing for his role. Jase watched with interest as they drove through downtown Sunset Plains. He'd arrived at Star Ranch by the highway and hadn't made it into town. Main Street was narrow, with businesses on each side, ranging from dilapidated to updated. Mason pulled the truck in front of one of the smaller storefronts. Jase glanced up at the pink and brown sign, grinning at the name, Cupcakes and Cowboys. That's strange. Mason frowned as they got out of the truck. What? Jase asked. Mason pointed to the handmade sign on the front door. All merchandise 50% off, today only, it said, in curly writing that must be Cassidy's. Maybe she felt in a sales mood today, Jase said. Cassidy has too thin of a profit margin for that. Mason pushed the door open, and a bell jingled. Jase's eyes widened at the overflowing bakery case. Cassidy straightened. Jase hadn't noticed her bent behind the display case, filling it with cupcakes. Cassidy, what happened? Mason asked. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she forced a tiny smile. Lightning fried the fridge and freezer. Now I have to sell everything or throw it away. Chapter 5. Cassidy hated that Jase was seeing her at her worst. The morning had been a complete disaster. She'd called the power company and the landlord, but an electrician couldn't make it until noon, and then it would take at least a few hours to rewire everything and replace the fried breakers. Meanwhile, the Oklahoma summer invaded the bakery, making its way into the creases and crevices of the old appliances. Cassidy had her doubts that the fridge and freezer would turn back on, even after the breakers were fixed. Best case scenario, it'd be evening before everything was up and running again. She knew that newer appliances would keep the food cold that long, but her ancient units didn't stand a chance. So she'd done the only thing she could think of, mixed a huge batch of frosting with the cream cheese from the fridge, and made a sign saying everything was half off. I had no idea. Mason walked around the counter and pulled her to him in a hug. She let him, relishing the comfort he provided. In the absence of Tanner, Mason was a much-needed surrogate older brother. Cassidy pulled back, aware that Mason held on a moment longer than was necessary. She didn't want to give him any ideas about the two of them. It'll be fine. She forced a brightness into her tone and ran her fingers underneath her eyes. I've posted on social media about the sale, and Pastor Mike already wants a few dozen cupcakes for the Bible study group. Hopefully, I'll get everything sold today. Then at least she wouldn't lose money, even if she didn't make any either. She wouldn't think about the cost of replacing the appliances. "What can we do to help?" Jase asked. Cassidy stifled a groan, no longer able to ignore Jase. His cowboy hat was too clean, the creamy white leather still unblemished by dirt or sweat. The designer jeans screamed Hollywood, and the scent of his cologne mixed with the baked goods in an enticing aroma. Everything about him said actor, except the words coming out of his mouth, and the genuine concern in his eyes. "Nothing. I know you have to get back to the ranch." "I wish we could stay." Mason's voice was heavy with regret. "We're picking up a prescription for the cows, and they need it as soon as possible. But I wanted to bring you lunch since we were coming this way." He held out a container of food. Cassidy took it, her heart swelling with affection. "That's really sweet of you." "Are you sure there's nothing we can do before leaving?" Mason asked. Cassidy opened her mouth to reassure him she was fine. She'd make do, just like always. "I can stay," Jase said. Cassidy's eyes flew up to his. "No, you're shadowing Mason. But you need help, and I can give it. I bet you can answer my questions about ranching as well as Mason. I've mostly been observing today anyway." Mason looked back and forth between Cassidy and Jase, his brow creased. "I'm not sure that's a good idea. I wouldn't be able to pick you back up. Cassidy can give me a ride." He couldn't stay. Confusing feelings about the sexy ranch guest was the last thing she needed today. "I might not get home until late. It depends on what the electrician says." "That's okay. Today, I'm at your disposal." Mason's scowl deepened. "I was going to show you how to administer medicine to the cows. You're here to learn about ranching, right? Cassidy needs my help, and I'm going to give it." A bitter taste filled Cassidy's mouth at the fact that this actor was offering to help. Had Drew told him to give her a hard time? Jase had been nominated for an Oscar after all, even if he hadn't won. His shock yesterday when she brought up her ex could have been feigned. She couldn't trust him. Mason gave Cassidy a "want me to make him leave" glance. "I can send your mom into town when I get back. Let her know you need help." "I'm staying." Jase folded his own arms, mimicking Mason's stance. "It's my choice what I do while at the ranch, and today I'm choosing to help Cassidy." If she kept protesting, she'd come off as a jerk. Jase hadn't done anything to earn her ire. Not really. She should give him the benefit of a doubt. "Okay, then. Thank you." She tried to sound grateful, but the words came out more grudging. Mason nodded slowly, his jaw set, eyes unreadable. "I'll get going then." He tipped his hat and left, leaving an oppressive silence in his wake. Now what? Cassidy shifted from foot to foot. "You didn't have to stay and help." "I know, but I wanted to." Jay shoved his hands in his pockets. "I didn't know about Drew. I'm sorry if my presence has brought up bad memories." The air flew from her lungs like she'd been thrown from a horse. "What?" "Drew. I didn't know he was your ex-fiancé. Mason let it slip. He thought I knew." "Oh." She reached up, fingering the end of her braid. "Yeah, you seemed confused when I mentioned him yesterday." "He lied in those interviews. I can't stand Drew. He's a self-serving parasite." The corner of her mouth twitched with reluctant respect for Jase. "Really?" He moved forward, and the spark between them ignited. "Absolutely. I hope I never have to work with him again." His cheeks dimpled in a genuine smile, and she had the ridiculous urge to smile back. She wanted to believe him. But actors were experts in lying. I should have guessed as much. I know better than to rely on anything Drew claims. I'm not like him, and I don't want to fight with you while I'm here. Can we start over?" She twisted her hair around one finger. That morning, she'd been determined to ignore Jase, but here he was, offering an olive branch she very much wanted to take. I can be cordial to him, Cassidy thought. No reason he should be punished for Drew's bad behavior. "Starting over sounds nice. Thank you, and thanks for helping me today. Of course. He took off his cowboy hat and set it on a table, his gaze traveling around the shop. "You've got a great business here. Did you do this all yourself?" Pride flowed through her, and she nodded. "Most of it." "How long ago did you open?" His easy questions surprised her as much as her easy answers. 4 months. Valentine's Day weekend was the grand opening. Wow, that's recent. I didn't put my plans into action until after. She didn't need to define what after meant. She could see in his eyes he understood. "He was an idiot," he whispered, stepping closer. She tipped her head back to see his face. "I would never have given all this up for L.A." She did take a step back then, busying herself with cramming a few more red velvet cupcakes into the display case. Cordial was one thing. Allowing herself to develop a crush was another. "You don't enjoy life in California?" "I've never really had anything to compare it to, but Oklahoma seems like a nice change of pace." Cassidy snorted. She couldn't help herself. "You would pick life as a rancher over being a movie star?" "I don't know. My mother is a Hollywood icon, has been since before I was born. I fell into this life. Now I'm not sure if it's the one I want to keep." Cassidy cleared her throat and wiped her hands on her apron. "Well, thank you for helping me today, anyway. I need to clean out the fridge and freezer in the back. Can you keep an eye on things up here and come get me if a customer shows up?" "Sure thing. I'll watch this store like nobody's watched it before." He winked. "I'm good for more than taking off my shirt on the big screen." Cassidy's stomach trembled, and she quickly disappeared into the back. Jace was proving to be nothing like she'd expected. Chapter 6. What was he doing? Jace shook his head at his own stupidity. Had he seriously given up a day of learning about ranch life in favor of babysitting a cupcake shop? He must be losing his mind. But Cassidy needed him, and he couldn't look into those worried gray eyes, see the stress lines creasing her forehead, and not help. Jace kept an eye on the front of the store while Cassidy took care of things in the back and dealt with the electrician. Jace tried to make himself useful, but the shop was spotlessly clean and tidy. Eventually, he gave up trying to look busy and sank into one of the armchairs at the front of the store. He spent 30 minutes on his phone researching ranching terms, then found himself on a property website, looking at acreage for sale around Sunset Plains. What am I doing? He clicked on a 5-acre plot of land not far from Star Ranch. Yes, Oklahoma was a lot more peaceful and idyllic than he'd expected it to be. But just because it felt nice to escape California for a while didn't mean he was ready to give it all up. He flipped through the pictures of the land. A small house sat on the property, but looked run down and dilapidated. The photos couldn't hide how chipped and faded the blue 1950s cabinets looked. The garish pink tile in the bathroom made him cringe, and the flooring consisted mainly of plywood, like someone had ripped out the carpet and never bothered to replace it. But Jace could tear that house down and build a new one to suit his needs and preferences. He flipped to the next picture, which showcased a small stream meandering through tall grasses. He closed his eyes and imagined lying on a blanket, the warm summer sun caressing his skin as a horse drank his fill from the water. A woman snuggled close against his side, laughing at something he said. Blonde hair tumbled from the braids slung over one shoulder and tickled his face. His eyes flew open. What was wrong with him? He barely knew Cassidy. The bell on the front door jingled. Jace quickly shoved his phone back in his pocket and rose. A middle-aged woman, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, let the door swing shut behind her. She paused when she saw Jace, and he watched her eyes light with recognition. "Oh my gosh!" She let out a girlish giggle and rushed forward, holding out her hand. "Are you Jase Larson? I love all your movies." Jace blinked, trying to slip into his movie star persona. He should have anticipated that customers might recognize him, but he'd been caught off guard. "I'm so glad you enjoyed them." "What on earth are you doing in Sunset Plains, Oklahoma?" Researching a role, actually. Jase flashed her a smile. I'm out at the Erickson ranch, but I'd appreciate it if you kept that quiet. Don't worry, I know how to keep a secret. She winked, then fumbled in her purse for a piece of paper. Can I have your autograph? Of course. Jase took the receipt she pulled from her purse and signed it. Now, what can I help you with today? Cassidy's cowboy boots alerted Jase to her presence, making a soft click against the laminate flooring with each step. Mrs. Collins? I thought I heard your voice. Mrs. Collins clutched the signed receipt in her hand. I heard about the sale and rushed right over. What happened, dear? Cassidy explained about the power outage, but Jase paid more attention to the way she lit up when talking about the bakery than the words coming out of her mouth. She looked so content here, even with the unexpected stress of the power outage. I hope Annabeth isn't too upset with me, Cassidy said, the tension in her voice bringing Jase back to earth. I wish I could help her out with the wedding cake. Mrs. Collins patted Cassidy's hand. Her lips curved upward in an understanding smile. Annabeth will get over it. I know it's hard for you. Cassidy blinked, and Jase caught the sparkle of tears. Let me get you your cupcakes and cookies. She walked behind the counter and pulled out a bakery box. The real question is how you got Jase Larson to work for you, Mrs. Collins said, a twinkle in her eye. Cassidy needed help, so I'm providing it. Jase shrugged. Why were people always so shocked when celebrities acted like normal people? Jase is staying at the ranch for a few months to prepare for an upcoming movie. He was nice enough to help me out today. 1 month, Jase corrected her. Cassidy raised an eyebrow. The production timeline has been moved up. I'm only staying for a month. Oh. Did he detect a note of disappointment in her voice? A whole month? Maybe I'll see you again, Jase Larson. Annabeth would love to meet you, I'm sure. Mrs. Collins took her credit card back from Cassidy and grabbed the pastry box. Have a good day, you two. As soon as the door shut, Cassidy turned to Jase. I thought you were staying 4 months. Me too, but my mother, the producer, called last night, and everything's changed. Oh? He heard the unspoken question in her voice, but suspected she was too polite to ask. She doesn't approve of method acting and thinks I'm wasting my time shoveling manure. He made air quotes with his fingers and rolled his eyes. We start shooting in 4 weeks. Cassidy frowned, a crease forming in her brow. Now I feel even worse taking you away for a day. He wanted to pull her into his arms and assure her he didn't mind. Don't be. I want to help. Well, thank you. Jase was starting to recognize Cassidy's tells, and playing with her braid when she was uncomfortable was one of them. Time to change the subject. So, who's Annabeth? A girl I went to high school with. She asked me to make her wedding cake, but I turned her down. Jase looked around at the empty bakery. Business didn't exactly seem to be booming, and only 4 months in, surely Cassidy still experienced cash flow issues. Why? I don't do wedding cakes. And with that, she disappeared into the back of the bakery. Jase cursed under his breath. Did Drew have any idea how much damage he'd done? Things picked up after that, and Cassidy spent the next few hours at the front of the shop, helping customers. Word got out that Jase was in town, and he signed autographs and posed for pictures. But mostly, he watched Cassidy. She knew everyone, and everyone knew and loved her. Her face glowed with pride as she rung up each customer, handing over the little box of cupcakes or cookies. The electrician fixed the breakers, restoring power, but the fridge and freezer didn't turn back on. By the time the repairman left at around 3:30, Cassidy's brow was lined with worry. Everything okay? Jase asked. Cassidy's slumped shoulders were answer enough. The lightning fried both the fridge and freezer. He said it had cost more to repair them than they're worth. Her lips pursed into a tight line. I need to call the insurance company and see if new appliances are covered. Excuse me. When Cassidy came back an hour later, she was smiling. "Insurance will cover it," she said. "I just have to take pictures and send the repairman's report to them. I'll have to pay the deductible and maybe the difference in cost since I bought those used and they aren't worth a ton, but it's not as bad as I thought it would be." Jase wanted to hug her, but instead he stuck his hands in his pockets. "That's great." Cassidy nodded, the relief coming off her in waves. At 6 o'clock, she locked the door and flipped the sign to closed. "Phew," she said, sinking into a chair. "That's been the busiest day since opening week, I think." She nudged his foot with hers. "I suppose I can thank you for that. Mrs. Collins must have spread the word. She owns the pharmacy a few doors down." So much for Mrs. Collins being an excellent secret keeper. "I'm glad I could help." He just hoped photos of him at a cupcake shop in Oklahoma didn't go viral and alert everyone to his current location. "Want something?" Cassidy asked, motioning to the nearly empty display case. "It's the least I can do to repay you." He'd been dying to try a cupcake all day. If she'd inherited her mother's talent in the kitchen, her desserts promised to be divine. "Sure." Cassidy pulled a red velvet out of the display case and handed it to him. "The red velvet and vanilla are always the last left." The cupcake held a perfect spiral of cream cheese frosting, with dark chocolate shavings as a garnish. Jase peeled back the wrapping and took a giant bite, groaning in delight. The cake was moist and dense, a perfect blend of cream cheese and red velvet. "This is amazing." Cassidy smiled, taking a cupcake for herself. "I'm glad you like it." "You've got a good business going here. I can't believe you do this yourself every day. Do you have any employees?" "Just one. She comes a few afternoons a week, but she had today off." Jase couldn't help admiring Cassidy for going after her dream. She knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to work for it. Jase wasn't sure he had the same courage. The 5-acre plot popped into his head again, and he quickly brushed it aside. Burnout was normal. It didn't mean he should give up acting for a quiet life in Oklahoma. Cassidy finished her cupcake and wiped her mouth with a napkin. "Ready to go shopping? I've got to order new appliances and stop at the store, or I'll have nothing to sell tomorrow." "Ready," Jase said. The 1-hour drive to the big discount store in Tulsa flew by. Jase couldn't believe how easy it was to talk to Cassidy. She was genuine in a wholly unfamiliar way. For the first time in his life, he felt at home. Chapter 7. Cassidy hadn't expected Jase to be an asset while buying new appliances. He schmoozed the salesman with an autograph and selfie, then negotiated a rock-bottom price for the refrigerator and freezer, much lower than what Cassidy would have managed on her own, and convinced the salesman to throw in free next-day delivery. It was nothing short of a miracle. Once the insurance sent her a check, she'd end up only paying a few $100s out of pocket for brand-new appliances. She'd expected Jase to be another Drew, self-serving, conceited, and a little manipulative. Instead, he'd devoted an entire day to helping her and been gracious and kind to everyone they interacted with. She wasn't sure how to reconcile the two pictures of Jase in her head. Could she trust that she was seeing the real Jase, or was it all an act? The next day was filled with furious baking as Cassidy attempted to replenish her freezer stock, but all the baking in the world couldn't keep her thoughts from wandering to Jase. He was such a good conversationalist, funny but thoughtful too. Her heart jumped every time the front door jingled, hoping she'd walk into the front room to find him smiling. But she didn't see or hear from Jase all day. It was better that way, though. She didn't need to lose her heart to another actor. When she arrived home, it was after 8 o'clock, the sky brilliant with the oranges and pinks of a sunset. Cassidy got out of the car and headed toward the pasture, longing for the quiet and calm only Cupcake could provide. The horse heard her coming and lumbered over to the fence, nickering when Cassidy patted her nose. Cassidy reached into her pocket and pulled out a few sugar cubes, smiling at the tickle of lips against her palm. Cupcake kept her going in the months after Drew left. She'd been the one being in Cassidy's life who gave her unconditional love and didn't ask questions. "Hey, girl, I've missed you." Cupcake whinnied, nudging Cassidy's shoulder with her nose in a friendly hello. "How did the baking go today?" Cassidy jumped, whirling toward the voice, a hand to her chest. Cupcake let out a snort of concern. "You scared me." "Sorry." Jase emerged from the shadows of the barn. "I saw you come home and wanted to see how today went." Cassidy patted Cupcake's nose, calming the horse. "It went well, thank you. What did you do today?" "More fence repairs. Mason said tomorrow we'll be riding the range." "That's always fun. There's nothing like it." Jase adjusted his hat, tipping it back on his forehead. "I'm a little nervous. I've never ridden a horse before." "Never?" He shoved his hands in his pockets, and though the increasing darkness shadowed his face, she saw a hint of a blush creep up it. "I never had a reason to ride. I haven't needed to for a role until now, and it's not like there are a lot of horses in L.A. Cassidy shook her head. He'd never ridden, and tomorrow he'd spend a full day on the range. She headed toward the barn. "Come on. I can't believe Mason's going to let you go out on the range without at least the basics. I'll teach you." "Really?" She heard the eagerness in his voice as he followed her inside. Cassidy whistled for Cupcake, then grabbed a brush. "I don't want you embarrassing cowboys everywhere in that movie, so you'll have to learn how to saddle a horse. I'm sure Mason would have taught me a thing or two tomorrow." Cupcake entered the barn and came to a halt beside Cassidy. She handed Jase the brush. "Step 1 is brushing her down to make sure there's nothing on her back that'll be irritated by the saddle. Long, even strokes. No, not like that." She placed her hand on top of his, and heat shot through her. She felt his gaze on her, but steadfastly avoided it and focused on their hands. "Like this." She guided his brush along the horse, but soon he took control. She gulped, pulling her hand away. "I think that's good." "Cupcake seems like a calm horse." Cassidy smiled, giving the horse an affectionate pat. "I've had her since she was a filly. She was calm even then, one of the easiest horses we've ever broke." She grabbed the saddle pad and handed it to Jase. "Put the pad on at her shoulder, then slide it backward into place. We don't want Cupcake's hairs to get pinched. Then put on the saddle. Make sure you hook the stirrups onto the horn so they don't hit her." Jase nodded. Cassidy adjusted the pad, then Jase easily slid the saddle into place. She swallowed as his muscles flexed, bulging the arms of his shirt. Her mind replayed the movie trailers she'd seen of him without his shirt on, and she looked away, blushing. "Like this?" Jase asked. "Yes, you're a natural." Cassidy bent down, showing him how to tighten the cinch. When she turned around, he stood startlingly close. She let out a shaky breath. Cupcake's warm body pressed against her back, and Jase's warm eyes stared down into hers. "It's not real," she told herself. "He's an actor, trying to get into character." She wouldn't let another man manipulate her emotions and distract her from her dreams. "It's a lot simpler than I thought it would be," he said in a quiet voice. "There's not much to saddling a horse." He took a step back and her pulse slowed. What was wrong with her? This man was an actor. A nice one, sure, but still an actor that would be gone in 4 short weeks. She showed him how to connect the breast collar, then Cupcake obediently took the bit and let Cassidy finish bridling her. She instructed Jase to tighten the cinch strap one more time now that Cupcake had let out her breath, so the saddle wouldn't slide and dump him onto the ground. "I already feel like a real cowboy." Jase grinned. "Can I ride her?" "Sure, just place your foot in the stirrup and—" Jase didn't wait for her to finish. He swung onto Cupcake's back like he'd been born to ride. "Did I do it right?" He looked better than right. His back was straight, his head tall, cutting a striking silhouette against the darkening sky. "Yeah, that's great. You even mounted on the correct side. Always do it from the left." Cassidy handed him the reins and led them out into the corral. She sat on the fence and watched as Jase rode Cupcake around the corral, gradually growing more comfortable on the horse. She gave him instructions from her perch, leading him through a trot and lope after he had the hang of a walk. "This is fantastic." He brought the horse to a halt and dismounted, leading Cupcake by the reins to where Cassidy sat. Cassidy fed Cupcake another sugar cube. She's a calm horse. The ones they use on the range are more headstrong. Jase gave her a lazy smile. "I'm not worried. But it's almost dark, and we should probably get inside." Cassidy reluctantly nodded and followed Jase back into the barn, letting him lead Cupcake. She showed him how to remove the saddle and rub her down, then gave Cupcake a bucket of oats and left her in the stall for the night. "How have I gone my whole life without riding a horse?" Jase asked. Cassidy laughed. "It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Cupcake's my best friend." "I can see why. She's a special animal." Cassidy knew she should leave it at that and go inside. Don't get sucked in. It's not like this can go anywhere. But she craved Jase's presence, like a caffeine addict desperate for their morning coffee. "We could go riding sometime. For real, I mean. There's a nice spot I visit on Sundays to relax." She played with her braid, curling the end around her finger. "Would you like to come with me this week?" "I'd love to." Jase inhaled deeply. Darkness had fallen completely, and she could no longer make out his features. "I love it here. It's so peaceful and calm." "Don't you miss California?" "Not really. I like this slower pace of life." His phone rang, and he pulled it from his pocket, giving her an apologetic smile. "Hello?" His face darkened at whoever was on the other end, and for the next minute, he didn't say anything. Cassidy looked away, not wanting to intrude on a private moment, but not sure how to break away. Why had she invited him to go riding with her on Sunday? She'd never taken anyone to her special hideaway. It wasn't much, just a secluded tree near the edge of the property that perfectly shaded a picnic blanket. She could spend hours underneath it, reading a book or sleeping or just thinking about life. There was no reason for her to share that with someone who was barely more than a stranger, especially someone who would soon be leaving, someone who might be less than genuine. "I understand. Goodbye, Mother." Jase flicked off the phone, his agitation evident in the abrupt movement. "Sorry about that. I'll see you Sunday then?" "Around 2:00. That would give her enough time to get home from church and change." 2:00. He tipped his hat and smiled, but the way he gazed right through her said his thoughts were elsewhere. "I'll be there." Cassidy watched him stride toward the bunkhouse, his silhouette fading into the night. She put her hands to her flushed cheeks. What was wrong with her? She absolutely, positively could not fall for Jase Larson. Chapter 8. Jase let out a curse as he left Cassidy and strode toward the bunkhouse. The phone call with his mother gnawed at him. He'd antagonized his mother, his boss. And for what? "It's just burnout. I can push through it." She'd argued he needed to return to California a week before production started. But for once in his life, Jase held firm. Oklahoma called to him, as did the woman currently walking away. He wasn't ready to leave either behind. He couldn't wait to go riding with Cassidy on Sunday. The next few days were filled with hard work and learning the ins and outs of ranching. Jase had always considered himself physically fit, but ranch life worked muscles he hadn't realized he possessed. Each night he fell into bed feeling satisfied with a job well done. It filled him in a way acting never had, and that scared him. Jase spent Sunday morning helping Mason with the animals, then eagerly got ready for his riding date. Could he call it a date? With Cassidy. When she appeared in the barn, he'd already saddled 2 horses, Cupcake and Brownie, the horse he'd been riding. He chuckled at the names. Clearly, Cassidy picked them. "Wow, you've already got them saddled," Cassidy said from behind. He turned, his breath catching. Sunlight illuminated her from behind. She wore jeans that hugged her curves and a red tank top that managed to be both casual and sexy. Her blonde hair lay in its customary braid over one shoulder. I packed a lunch, too. He held up the basket. He'd asked the other cowboys for recommendations, then gone to a deli in town and ordered for both of them. Felt like the perfect day for a picnic. That was really thoughtful of you. Her cheeks pinked, and he loved the way it lit up her face. He watched Cassidy mount Cupcake in one fluid movement. Jace winced when he lowered himself into the saddle. He was still getting used to the long hours on a horse. Brownie was more headstrong than Cupcake, just like Cassidy said he would be, but Jace loved the feel of the animal beneath him. He followed Cassidy away from the barn and main buildings toward the south end of the ranch. Once the trail widened, he pulled Brownie up alongside Cupcake. How was business this week? Decent. A few people came in hoping to see you, I think. You're good for business. She gave him a fleeting smile. I'm happy to help. You deserve to succeed. She ducked her head, apparently uncomfortable with the compliment. Thank you. A lot of people thought I was crazy to open it. Drew? He asked softly. Yeah. She took a deep breath. Race ya. Before Jace could blink, Cassidy urged Cupcake into a gallop. Jace laughed, kicking Brownie into a faster pace and following. He clung to the saddle horn, leaning forward and keeping his heels down. The exhilaration of the hot wind blowing through his short hair eclipsed his fear of falling. Cassidy was at least 3 lengths ahead of him, her body crouched low over the horse as her braid flew behind her. A few minutes later, she started to slow. Jace caught up with her as she pulled to a stop near a cluster of trees. She dismounted and he did the same, his legs screaming in protest at the movement. But being a little saddle sore was well worth the exhilaration of riding with Cassidy. Here it is, she said breathlessly, holding out her hands. Jace glanced around. The stream cut through the grass, leaving only 50 feet between it and the fence marking the property boundaries. If he wasn't mistaken, it was the same stream that ran through the property for sale that he'd looked at online. Trees dotted the banks of the water, most small and new. But one tree grew tall and strong, towering above the others. Tall grass swayed in the breeze, the impossibly blue sky just meeting the tops of trees in the distance. It's not much, but I love it. Cassidy took his reins and looped them over the saddle horn. He raised an eyebrow and she smiled. They'll stay close. He nodded, watching as the 2 horses wandered away to graze. It's beautiful here. I feel like we're the only 2 people in the world. She smiled, clearly pleased. Exactly. The stream cuts close enough to the property line that the cows don't bother wandering this far. I love it. He walked over to Brownie and retrieved the food from her saddlebags. Cassidy laid a blanket underneath the biggest tree, and they both sat down. Jace handed her a sandwich, and her eyes lit up. Their food is my favorite. Good. I wasn't sure what to get, but all the boys assured me that Jackie's Diner is the best. They're right. The next few minutes passed in silence as they ate. Jace was beginning to understand why Cassidy loved the spot. The tree shaded them from the sun perfectly, and the light breeze passed over the stream and made the air a pleasant temperature. Are you getting what you hoped to get by coming to the ranch? Cassidy asked. For the role, I mean. He'd spent less time researching his upcoming role and more fantasizing about the rancher's daughter than he'd anticipated. I think so. Mason's great about answering my questions, and the other guys are all helpful too. I'm glad. I want you to feel like your time here has been worthwhile. He leaned on an elbow, giving her a lazy smile. Just meeting you would have made my time here worthwhile, Cassidy. She blushed scarlet, making her eyes sparkle and lips turn up in an embarrassed smile. I can see why you were nominated for an Oscar. You're very good at what you do. Do you think I'm acting with you? She looked away. You're famous. You make more money on one film than I'll make in a lifetime. I think you're getting into your role, and falling for the country girl is part of it. The words sliced through him, and he gritted his teeth. I'm not Drew. I know. But you still live in the same world as him. All the things that were points of contention with him exist with you. Constant traveling, never knowing if you're being genuine or playing a part, women fawning all over you. Everything she said was negative, but all Jase heard was that she'd thought of him in a relationship capacity. He reached out, caressing her cheek lightly with his finger. I don't enjoy the Hollywood lifestyle. I don't enjoy accounting, but it's still a part of my job. He leaned forward until they were close enough he could smell the strawberry scent of her shampoo. I like you, Cassidy. She exhaled, her minty breath surrounding him. I won't put aside my dreams for someone else again. I'm not asking you to. He cupped the back of her neck. All I'm asking for is trust. Let me prove I'm a decent guy. Can you do that? Her eyes held his and her tongue flicked out, licking her lips. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. It's not that easy. I know, but can you try? Her gray eyes were wide and vulnerable. Electricity sparked between them at every touch. Slowly, she nodded. I trust you. The weight of her trust surrounded him like a warm blanket. Jase brought his other hand to her cheek, caressing it with his thumb. She inhaled, her lips trembling, but she didn't pull away, didn't tell him to get lost. Slowly, he lowered his head toward hers. He paused, their lips almost touching, but not quite, giving her a chance to pull away. She leaned forward, bridging the distance between them. Their lips met, and Jase knew he was lost. Her fingers found their way into his hair, and he held her chin in place, tilting her face to deepen the kiss. Everything else disappeared. Why had he spent the last few years making movies in California when the life he wanted had been sitting right here in Oklahoma, just waiting for him to find it? Cassidy pulled away, her ragged breathing matching his own. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, biting her lip. The motion made him want to kiss her all over again, but he wouldn't push her farther than she, or he, could handle. She was worth taking things slow. What's it like in California? Cassidy asked. Jay struggled to focus on the conversation and not their kiss. Awful compared to here. They spent the next few hours laughing and talking. Jase loved hearing about Cassidy's plans for the bakery, her likes and dislikes. And she seemed just as interested in him, if that were possible. Him, and not his money, or fame, or social connections. Eventually, they packed up their lunch and rode back. Jase helped Cassidy unsaddle the horses, then left her with a soft kiss. Somewhere along the way, spending time with Cassidy became more important than researching his role. His phone buzzed and he pulled it out. A notification alerted him to a new email, the final script and cast list for the film. He scrolled through the list, noting a few unfamiliar names. Halfway down the list, he stopped scrolling, his eyes glued to one name: Drew Harrington. Chapter 9. Over the next 2 weeks, Cassidy saw Jase frequently. He ate dinner with the family more often than not, despite his initial claims he'd eat with the ranch hands. And she fell for him more every day. He was kind and considerate, where Drew was selfish and conceited. Mason even grudgingly admitted that Jase was a hard worker who picked up on ranching quickly. Cassidy tried to push her growing feelings aside and remind herself that Jase was leaving, and soon. Yes, his kisses filled her with fire, and she counted down the minutes until she'd see him again. But he was leaving in a week, and she doubted he'd ever return. Whatever he claimed, she couldn't make herself believe that this was for real. It wouldn't do to grow attached. He would never leave his career, and she wouldn't put hers aside. She should have said no when he asked if he could take her out tonight, but as much as it hurt to think of him leaving, she couldn't make herself push him away. Cupcakes and Cowboys had only been open for a few minutes when Cassidy got a call from the town's community college, asking if she could make a custom cake for a faculty training event they were having tomorrow. She said yes, thrilled at the money she would make. It almost made her forget about the wedding cake she could have had from Annabeth. Almost. Cassidy couldn't wait for Carrie to arrive so she could start on the cake. If she hurried, she might still make her date with Jase. She handed the box of cupcakes to the customer with a smile. Once the front door swung closed, she pulled out her phone and checked the time again. Just another 30 minutes. She refilled the display case with a few cupcakes. The wall phone rang, and she quickly grabbed it. Cupcakes and Cowboys, this is Cassidy. Cassidy? It's Carrie. Hey. Cassidy's eyes flicked to the wall clock. Hopefully this didn't mean Carrie would be late. What's up? I fell during cheer practice and hurt my ankle. I'm at urgent care right now, and they think I might have broken something. They're sending me to the hospital for x-rays. Oh, no. Cassidy knew how much Carrie loved cheerleading. If she'd broken something, she'd be out for her senior year. I don't think I'm going to make it in today. I'm really sorry. Of course you can't come in. Don't worry about it. Call me once you know what's going on, okay? You might need to take a few days off if it's serious. I will. Thank you. The relief in Carrie's voice was palpable. Cassidy said her goodbyes and hung up the phone. There was no way she could make her date with Jase now. She swallowed her disappointment, knowing it couldn't be helped. Cassidy pulled her cell phone from her apron pocket and dialed his number, hoping he wouldn't be upset. Whenever she'd changed plans on Drew, he'd given her the silent treatment, sometimes for days. Hey, pretty lady. Her spine tingled as the smooth warmth of his voice flooded her. Hi. I hope you're not calling to cancel our date. I've been looking forward to it all day. His directness startled her, but at least she wouldn't have to beat around the bush. I'm really sorry, Jase. I have a huge order I've got to get done tonight, and Carrie just called in sick. Can we reschedule for tomorrow, maybe? Jase was silent for a moment. Sunday would be fine. Thank you. Worry flowed through her at his cool tone, so like Drew's. They only called this morning about the order. It's really last minute, but the money's good. I understand. After saying goodbye, Cassidy hung up the phone. She tried to push the worry over Jase out of her mind. If that was how he dealt with disappointment, it was better she find out now than after wasting 3 years on the relationship like she had with Drew. Cassidy started her evening closing ritual at 5:45, since no one was in the store. She wiped down all the tables and straightened the chairs underneath them, then flipped off the small television playing the evening news. She wiped the chalkboard menu clean and updated it with tomorrow's cupcake of the day. The bell jingled. Cassidy's heart dropped, and she capped the liquid chalk marker. Normally, she didn't mind last-minute customers who lingered, especially if they emptied out her display cases. But tonight, she really didn't have the time. She slowly turned around. Her mouth fell open in shock. Jase stood in the doorway, that pristinely white cowboy hat on his head and a smile on his full lips. "What are you doing here?" Cassidy asked. "I thought I could help." "Help? With the order?" A snort escaped, and Cassidy quickly covered her mouth, giggling. "You want to help me decorate a cake?" "Hey, I helped you sell 'em, didn't I? You sounded pretty stressed on the phone, and I missed you. So what do you say? Can I help?" He wasn't upset. Relief flowed through her. She considered him, then nodded. "That would be great, actually. Thanks." The clock hit 6, and Cassidy locked the door and flipped off the lights. Jase followed her to the kitchen. "So, what are we making?" "We're decorating a cake for a faculty training event at the college. I baked the cakes when it was slow, and they're in the freezer so we can frost them easily. I thought something with bright primary colors that keeps with a back-to-school theme." "Sounds delicious and fun. Where do we start?" Cassidy motioned to the sink. "Wash your hands and find an apron." Jase nodded. Cassidy grabbed a 16-inch round cardboard base and set it on her cake stand. After washing her hands, she mixed the buttercream to dirty ice the cakes. "How was work today?" Cassidy asked as she mixed. "Great. Mason showed me how to change the timing belt on a truck. I didn't expect to do stuff like that as a rancher. It's method acting at its finest." She imagined Jace hunched over the hood of a truck, hands black with grease. It made her smile. "What made you decide to adopt method acting? I've never really asked." Cassidy expected an answer about how dedicated he was to his craft or how it made his performances better. What she hadn't expected was for him to look away, rubbing his thumb along the edge of the countertop. "It lets me be someone else for a while." Cassidy's brows knit together. He'd never said anything like this to her before. "You're Jase Larson. Men want to be you, and women want to be with you. Why would you want to be anyone else?" He took her hand gently in his. "I've always been in Hollywood. I've grown up with the glitz and glamour. Sometimes I'm not sure if that's the life I want or the only life I've known." He motioned to the bakery. "This, Oklahoma, is the most I've ever connected with a role. It feels like what I've always wanted to do and who I want to be. You've shown me that, Cassidy." She swallowed, looking away. He was so different from Drew in every possible way. "It's a good life. I wouldn't trade it for anything." His eyes locked with hers. "What if things had turned out differently between you and Drew?" She heard the unspoken question in his words. "What happens with us after I leave?" "I want to be with you," she thought, her heart hammering in her chest. "I need you. I don't want to lose you." But she couldn't lose herself in a relationship again. She wouldn't give up the bakery. When she spoke, her words were slow but deliberate. "I would have followed him to Los Angeles, but I'm not willing to sacrifice my dreams for someone else's anymore." She expected Jace's eyes to flash with anger or maybe hurt, but he just nodded. "You shouldn't have to. He didn't deserve you, Cassidy. I'm sure it didn't feel like it at the time, but you're lucky to have escaped." "I know that now, but it doesn't make it any easier." "What happens after next week?" She was desperate to ask the question, but terrified of the answer. Jace took a slow step forward. Cassidy held her breath, his body heat filtering through the inches between them and warming her skin. Slowly, his head lowered toward hers. His phone rang, breaking the silence. Cassidy cleared her throat and took a step back. What was she doing? After next week, he'd go back to his life, and she'd go back to hers. "Hello?" Jace was silent as he listened to the other side of the call. His brow furrowed into a line. "That wasn't our original agreement. You're sure nothing can be done?" "Yeah, I understand. Yes, I said I'll be there." He flipped the phone closed, his chest heaving. "Is everything okay?" Cassidy asked. "That was my mother. She scheduled my flight home." "Oh." Cassidy blinked, hoping he wouldn't see the tears that were forming. "It's not that strange. The studio often makes travel arrangements for the cast members, but we're usually in on the plans." "When do you leave?" 3 days. 3 days. Her heart ached. This really was ending. He kissed her softly on the forehead and wrapped her in his embrace. She felt his unspoken pain and knew he didn't want to leave any more than she wanted him to. Ask him to stay. But no. They lived completely different and incompatible lifestyles. She wouldn't put her career aside in favor of an actor's again. "So, how do we decorate this cake?" Jase asked. Cassidy shook her head, struggling to clear it. She would enjoy these last 3 days, and then kiss him goodbye and not look back. Her heart couldn't handle another actor. Chapter 10. Jase had thoroughly enjoyed his time with Cassidy, right up until the phone call. 3 days. 3 days, and he'd go back to California and his life there, then on to Texas for filming. He knew Cassidy wouldn't come with him, and he'd never ask her to. She belonged here in Oklahoma with her bakery and her family and the ranch. She could never be happy in California, and besides, their relationship was still so new. He tossed in his bunk, throwing the covers off him as the muggy air turned stifling. How could he leave Oklahoma when for the first time in his life he was the person he wanted to be? But could he be that person while still being an actor, too? Was it acting he hated, or the Hollywood lifestyle? Did he have to give up one to have the other? And was he allowing his feelings for Cassidy to blind him to the choice he should make? Jase went through his morning chores with bleary eyes and slow motions. Jase took extra care with Cupcake, wishing he had 3 more months with Cassidy like he'd originally planned, instead of 3 days. He'd only scratched the surface of ranch life, and he wanted to keep digging, spend his days riding the range and his evenings kissing Cassidy. Maybe he could have both and live in Oklahoma in between roles. He spent every free moment with Cassidy over the next 3 days. On his last day at the ranch, he and Mason ended the day in the barn. As Jase brushed the horses, he thought of not riding Brownie tomorrow and felt a physical pang. "I think we're done here," Mason said. Jase pulled out his phone and glanced at the time. Already? It's only 4 o'clock. In the 4 weeks he'd been there, they'd never stopped working before 5. "It's a slow day, and I'm sure you've got packing to finish up." Mason held out his hand. "It was a pleasure working with you, Jase. I hope the movie goes well." Jase gave him a firm handshake. "Thanks for everything, Mason." Jase left the barn, eager to take a shower and spend the rest of the evening with Cassidy. The emptiness he felt when they were apart gnawed at his chest like a hole that only she could patch. After a quick shower, he headed back outside. He froze when he saw a tall man leaning against his car in expensive jeans and a V-neck shirt. Drew. Jase stared, trying to figure out why Drew was there. Drew looked up and smiled at Jase. "Hey, man." He held out a hand and brought Jase in, clapping him on the back. Jase pulled away, shoving his hands in his pockets. He'd never liked Drew, but he'd never been outright hostile toward him either. "You won't latch on to me again, you filthy parasite." Jase dreaded working with him again. He wouldn't be so civil this time around. Falling for Cassidy had solidified his opinion of Drew. Anyone who could treat her so cruelly had to be an awful human being. "What are you doing here?" Jase asked. "I was in Tulsa visiting family when I heard you were at my old stomping grounds. Thought I'd drop by for old time's sake. Your mother booked us on the same flight. I offered to make sure you were on it." "My mother should mind her own business. I've already finished packing." Jase folded his arms, fury burning hot within him. "Does Cassidy know you're here?" Drew raised an eyebrow. "She told you?" "Cassidy and I have grown close over the last few weeks." A cruel grin pulled at the corners of Drew's mouth. "Be careful with that one. She'll do anything to keep you in a relationship once it starts." Jase curled his hands into fists. "That's not how I hear it." "Well, women always do try and spin things in their favor." "You didn't answer my question. Does she know you're here?" "Of course not. I haven't talked to her in a year. This week, in fact." He smirked. "Wow, I'd forgotten." Jase grabbed Drew by his shirt and dragged him toward the bunkhouse. Drew swore, yanking himself free. "What are you doing?" "Getting you inside, where Cassidy won't see you." He knew she could handle herself, but he didn't want to subject her to the pain of seeing Drew, not until he could explain. She should still be at the bakery, but he wasn't taking any chances. He opened the bunkhouse door and threw Drew inside. Luckily, the room was empty. Jase glanced at the clock on the wall. He had about 20 minutes to make Drew disappear before cowboys started trickling in. Then, he would finally do what he should have done to begin with and tell Cassidy he'd be working with Drew one last time. She's still that hung up on me, huh? I guess I'm not surprised. I bet she'd love to get her hands on my money. No doubt she'd be supportive now that I've made it. But back when I was still trying, all she could do was nag. Jase pointed an angry finger in Drew's face. Don't talk about her like that. Get away while you still can. She'll try and ruin your career, just like she tried to stop mine before it even began. You're leaving. Now. And you're coming with me. The studio booked us hotel rooms in Tulsa. Our flight leaves early. Jase chewed on his lip, hating that he let his mother treat him like a child. She didn't control his career, even if she believed otherwise. But if he didn't go, he'd get fired for being difficult, not a reputation he wanted, or she'd show up here herself. He wasn't sure which would be worse. But he hadn't made his final decision yet about acting, so he needed to keep his options open. Okay, give me a minute to grab my things, and then we can leave. He'd make sure Drew stayed in the car while he said goodbye to Cassidy. He'd tell her about Drew after they were both safely back in California, so their last moments together wouldn't be ruined by him. 5 minutes later, Jase headed toward the door, Drew on his heels. He opened it, to Cassidy standing on the step, hand reaching for the knob. He blinked, then quickly moved, trying to hide Drew from her view. What are you doing home? Carrie told me she could close up. I wanted to see you. She peered around his shoulder. Can I come in? Drew's hand rested on the door, forcing it open. His eyes slowly roved Cassidy's body. Didn't expect to see you while I was here. You're looking a lot better than the last time I saw you. Haven't thrown up lately, huh? Cassidy's face froze. Then she blinked, and Jase saw the open hostility shine through. She glanced back and forth between him and Drew. So it's true. He's in the movie too? Yes, Jase gulped. He should have known she'd find out. Just a minor role. I didn't know he was coming here. Well, then. See ya. I hope your stay here was satisfactory. Cassidy turned on her heel and strode across the wide expanse of grass. Jase raced after her, heart pounding. He grabbed her arm, but she shook him off. I didn't know he was coming. Seems like the two of you are pretty chummy. Cassidy, let me explain. She turned, and the disappointment in her eyes made him catch his breath. You know how much he hurt me, and you brought him here without any warning. Were you even going to say goodbye before you left? Of course. He clutched at her hand, hoping to make her understand. This doesn't have to be it. She pulled from his grasp. We both knew it couldn't last. It was nice knowing you, Jase. The words were a slap in the face. Cassidy, don't follow me. He stood frozen. With sudden clarity, it hit him. This was what he wanted. She was what he wanted. He didn't care about the production, or Drew, or Hollywood, or what his mother wanted. The only thing in life that really mattered to him was walking away. Chapter 11. Cassidy walked back to the homestead, praying her legs wouldn't give out until she was safely locked inside. The tears burned for release, but she wouldn't let them. Not this time. She was done crying over men who didn't care for her. Jase had lied to her. He'd brought Drew right to her home, even knowing how much he'd hurt her. She was sure Drew was partly to blame, but in the end, all that mattered was Jase hadn't cared. Cassidy closed the kitchen door and sank to the floor, glad that neither of her parents were home. Her entire body shook with adrenaline. Drew had looked at her so coldly, like she was a fly he couldn't wait to squash. How had she almost married him? A few minutes later, she heard the purr of a car engine. A sob ripped from her chest. Jase was really leaving. Cassidy didn't sleep well that night and was at the bakery even earlier than normal the next morning. She baked cupcakes and cookies to refill the display cases, then counted the money in the cash till and straightened the front room. She wondered if Jase had boarded the plane yet, if he was even now flying away from her and back to his old life. She was so tired of being left behind. She glanced around the bakery. Maybe I'm being stubborn. Maybe I should have offered to go with him. But no. She hadn't been happy forgetting herself for Drew. She wouldn't be happy doing the same for Jase either. She folded her arms, trying to hold herself together. This pain would pass. She'd made the right decision. A knock sounded rapidly on the glass door. Cassidy looked up, surprised to see Annabeth. She quickly unlocked the door and let her inside. "What's wrong?" "It's awful." Annabeth's hair was pulled back in a loose braid, her eyes swollen and red. A pit formed in Cassidy's stomach. "What's awful?" But she already knew the answer. There was only one reason Annabeth would be here now. "The cake." Annabeth pulled out her phone and showed Cassidy a picture. "I refuse to even take it home from the bakery. I don't know what I'm going to do." Cassidy took the phone, zooming in to see the details. Cracked sugar flowers that looked cartoonish instead of realistic, tumbled down, wrinkled and sagging fondant. The cake layers tilted visibly, collapsing under its own weight, probably due to a lack of support dowels. "Oh, Annabeth. The wedding's tomorrow." "Who made this cake?" "I was angry and didn't take any of your suggestions." Annabeth wiped at her eyes. "I found a random bakery in Tulsa. Please, Cassidy, if you can't help me, I won't have anything for tomorrow." Cassidy's hands trembled, and she clasped them together to stop the movement. She closed her eyes and pictured Drew's cruel smile while insulting her, felt his words crush her, raged that the stress of his leaving resulted in losing their child. She remembered years of pain and hurt as she ignored all her own wants and needs in favor of what was best for him. She blinked, staring at Annabeth. Her face was free of makeup, her creamy skin pale and splotchy. Dark circles rimmed bloodshot eyes. Her clasped hands silently pleaded for help. If Cassidy didn't make the cake, there would not be one. Annabeth wouldn't get to laugh as her new husband smeared frosting over her face. There would be no pictures of the cake-cutting ceremony for the wedding scrapbook. Cassidy forced the bad memories behind a door and locked them up, throwing away the key. Annabeth shouldn't suffer for Drew's poor behavior. Cassidy's wedding had ended in a shamble of broken dreams, but Annabeth's didn't need to end the same. "I'll do it." Cassidy forced the words from her lungs, and they echoed around the empty bakery. Annabeth let out a sigh of relief, her shoulders sagging as tears filled her eyes. "Thank you." "What flavors of cake did you want?" "As long as it doesn't look like that," Annabeth pointed at her phone. "I don't care what it tastes like. You could serve styrofoam and I'd be okay with it. We're having a sundae bar as dessert for the guests, so we can get by without serving the cake as refreshment." "There's no need for styrofoam. I can bake when things are slow." Cassidy handed the phone back. "Can you text me the sample picture so I can reference it?" "I'll send it right now." Annabeth's fingers flew over the keyboard. "Name your price. I don't care how much at this point. We'll need to pick it up by 10 tomorrow morning. Is that okay?" Cassidy nodded, glad that tomorrow was Sunday so she could spend the day sleeping. She thought fleetingly of her bed. Between the rush cake order this week and not sleeping well the last few nights, she was exhausted. But she couldn't let Annabeth go cakeless tomorrow. She just couldn't. Cassidy worked all night, treating each detail with meticulous care. Memories overwhelmed her. Despite working with vanilla bean and chocolate fudge, she could almost smell the spice cake that had made her so ill. As she created the roses out of gum paste and coated them with pink luster dust, she saw the dark red and yellow roses on her own cake. When the cake was finished, with barely 30 minutes to spare, Cassidy stood back and admired it with a critical eye. Roses cascaded elegantly down 5 tiers. She'd piped even and steady on 2 of the layers in a shimmery pearl color, adding an elegance to the overall feel. The fondant was smooth, the roses realistic and uncracked. The tiers were evenly placed and with enough support to not sink like the disastrous first cake. It was beautiful, and would be the perfect centerpiece at Annabeth's wedding. All vestiges of sorrow disappeared as Cassidy looked at the cake, proud of her work. It no longer represented a painful time in her life, but the ability to bring happiness to someone else. It was just a cake. What had she been so afraid of? A quiet knock sounded at the front door. Cassidy blinked, the moment broken, and let Annabeth and Mrs. Collins in. "Sorry we're early," Annabeth said. "We're on our way to the church, but I wanted to see the cake first." "I just finished it," Cassidy said. They followed her to the back room, and she stood aside, giving them a clear view. Annabeth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Then she threw her arms around Cassidy. "It's perfect! Thank you so much!" "You have no idea what a load this takes off of us," Mrs. Collins said. Annabeth lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry about what I said when you told me no. I've been a bridezilla the past few months." Cassidy gave her a warm smile. "It's okay. I'm actually glad you needed me. Decorating a wedding cake wasn't as hard or as scary as I thought it would be." They wrote Cassidy a check with a substantial bonus. Cassidy tried to refuse, but they insisted. So she thanked them, gratitude filling her with the knowledge that the bakery was safe for another month. She could definitely stay open until the holiday rush, and then that would take her through to February or March, at least. Slowly, bit by bit, she'd reach her goals. She thought fleetingly of Jace and the life she'd almost had. But she knew she'd made the right decision. She could never be happy watching someone else chase their dreams. Cassidy boxed up the cake, then helped Annabeth and Mrs. Collins load it into the back of the SUV. As the SUV disappeared around a corner, Cassidy let go of the hurt Drew had caused her. For the first time in a year, she felt ready to heal. Back inside, she got to work cleaning up the disastrous kitchen. She thought about leaving it for later, but knew her exhaustion wouldn't improve. After an hour of cleaning, she turned off the lights and locked up the door, struggling to keep her eyes open. Blasting the radio while the breeze whipped her hair helped fight her exhaustion on the drive home. The sun shone bright in the sky as she parked outside her house and got out of the car. She froze and blinked. Jace sat on the front step, his 2 white cowboy hat on his head, a dimple in one cheek. Her stomach swarmed with butterflies. Had she fallen asleep and started dreaming? Her heart thundered in her chest like a galloping horse, and she placed a trembling hand over her mouth. Jace rose and strode toward her, his steps uncertain. "Hi," he said. "Hi." Her shaking hand found her braid, and she curled the end around her finger. "Jace. Here. What did this mean?" "I thought you'd be back in Los Angeles by now." "I couldn't get on the plane." Her eyes slowly met his. He hadn't boarded the plane. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I don't want that life. I want you. I want this life." He gestured to the ranch. "I told my mother to recast my part, and I'm meeting with a realtor tomorrow to look at properties nearby. After glimpsing what life could be like with you, I couldn't go back to what it used to be. I'm finally ready to make my choice." A strangled sob tore from her. Slowly, Jace pulled her into his arms. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I've never been more certain. I haven't been happy with my career for a while. When I came to Oklahoma, it was like breathing for the first time in years." She placed a soft hand on his chest. "I don't want you to resent me." "This is the choice I'd make regardless of whether you were in the equation. You're just the icing on the cupcake." She laughed, burying her face in his chest. Slowly, he tipped her chin up, his eyes searching hers for permission. She gave a slight nod. His lips caressed hers, light as a feather. She wrapped her hand around the back of his neck and drank him in as he pressed her closer. She let herself melt, breathing in the smell of his cologne. Eventually, he broke away, leaning his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. I can't believe I almost lost you. I thought you were choosing Hollywood over me. I thought I was just a fling. Not even close. I've spent my entire existence pretending. I've lied to myself about who I am and lived in a world that's artificial. You showed me life can hold meaning. With you, I feel alive. I finally feel whole. You give me the courage to stop pretending and be myself. His fingers brushed against her cheek and she shivered, leaning into him. I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving to you how real this is. And then he kissed her again. This has been Cupcakes and Cowboys, Sunset Plains Romance Book 1. Written by Lindzee Armstrong. Narrated by Stacey Glemboski. Copyright 2016 by Lindzee Armstrong. Production copyright 2016 by Lindzee Armstrong.
Hey, it's Lindzee Armstrong again. Thank you so much for listening to this audiobook. I really hope you enjoyed it. I've got more than 20 books published, and I hope to make more of them available on YouTube soon. You can help make this happen by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. If you want to check out more of my books, you can head over to my website, lindzeearmstrong.com, and join my newsletter. I'll send 3 free ebooks to your inbox immediately. You can also find my books on Amazon, Apple, Kobo, Nook, and Google Play, pretty much wherever ebooks are sold. I'll drop the links below so you can check it out if you're interested. Thanks for listening.